All right, just kind of a recap of where we're at. Of course, we already looked at chapter 1 and got through chapter 1 fairly easy. We know that the book of Judges does more than just relate historical information regarding this period of Israel's history. It really is a spiritual context more than a political history for Israel. And so when we keep that in our mind, when we put that in the framework of where we're at, it gives us a better understanding of exactly what Judges means to us, and then how we should take what we should take away from that as we look at the book itself. Of course, we know that, particularly as we saw this in chapter 1, that Israel's failure to evict the people of the land as God had commanded them led to results that God had predicted in Joshua 1:27 through chapter 2, verse 4. So we know that there are issues and problems here that have continued to go on because of this prediction that Joshua made from it. We know that the Canaanites were a nation that were a thorn to Israel. The land was constantly in turmoil because of this chaos that they were. And in desperate times, the people of Israel acknowledged they would their slide into sinfulness and then cry out to God, and then they'd look for the deliverer. And we're going to talk about that again because we'll look at the cycle of sin here again tonight just to continue to put that before us. I want to keep that out in front of us because we have to understand exactly what goes on, what is happening in the book of Judges and what they're doing. And then God sends these unique leaders, these judges, these people before them to really deliver them. And we're going to start to see that now in chapter 2, starting around verse 16 to 19. We're going to start seeing this really play out a little bit. Now, the one thing about Judges, and we really didn't mention this when we did the introduction, was we didn't say that there's not an exact chronological order of how these judges went. Now, we just take them in the order that they're given to us in Scripture, but we're not sure about the exact order of the way things went. So in most critical commentaries relate that to us, that they're not really sure about that, how they fit or where they were at. But it was just the point that each one of these judges were called up at a specific time for a specific purpose, for a specific reason, to lead Israel out of the situation that they had in. Now, as the writer of Judges brings to us clearly, we see this constant cycle that goes on before them. And so with that, we see that always happening. We'll get to that here in just a second. If you will, go to the next slide, Brian. The brief outline for chapter 2, for Judges chapter 2, God's pronouncement of judgment. And that's really what we're going to be looking at tonight, is God's pronouncement of judgment on verses 1 through 5. Then we're going to see Israel's failure and God's patient response as we go through Judges 2. And then finally, God dealt with Israel and why he dealt with them the way that he did and stuff. If you will, turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Think about using this instead of Ford.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay. Anyhow, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, I want to look at here real quick. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites and the Gerishites, the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. Now, you got to remember here, all these ites are in the land of Israel right now. They're in the land that's been promised to the nation of Israel by God. And what God is saying here is, listen, when the Lord brings you into this land which you will go up and possess. Now let's stop there for a second, because we know what happens Because when Moses sends out the 12 spies to go out and spy out the land, 10 of them come back and they significantly lobby, saying what? Saying that, listen, we can't go over. Yeah, the land is full of milk and honey. The land is great. Man, it would be a great land to have. But what do they say? Listen, we can't do it. These guys are too big. Everything's just too big for us. We can't do it, except for Caleb and Joshua, who say what? Listen, God's on our side. We'll be able to do that. And we know that God has said that because in Deuteronomy here, He has chosen a people. He's chosen this nation, Israel. And He said, listen, these 7 nations are greater than you are. They're significant. They're more significant than you. But yet, when you go over and you take the land, I'm going to drive them out. Now look at verse 2. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor shall you show mercy to them. Now again here, chapter 2, what's he saying to them? Listen, I'm going to deliver all these 7 nations, these 7 mighty nations, into your hand. And you're utterly going to conquer them and destroy them, and you're going to wipe them out, essentially. And he tells them very clearly here, in this verse, he says here what? He says, listen, you're not to make a covenant with them. You're not to do any of this thing with them, because if you do this thing with them, it is going to be bad for you. So he tells them very clearly, you're not going to do this. Now look at verse 3. Nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. And in verse 4, for they will turn your sons away from following me and to serve other gods, so that the anger of the Lord would be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Now see, he gives them a warning here. God already says, listen, I'm going to make you a great nation. You will be a great nation. You are a great nation. I'm going to take care of these 7 nations before you. But listen, when you go in there, you know, you're not to show them any mercy. You got to get them out of there. But he says very clearly to them that what? He says, listen, you're not to get into marriages with them. Your sons are not to take wives. Your daughters are not to take husbands out of them. You shouldn't do it. Because what happens here? Now, I think it's interesting here that it talks about the sons will turn away from following me to serve other gods, so that the anger of the Lord would be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Now, let's take a break there. What was the very first commandment? What was the very first commandment? Yeah. To love the Lord your God and have no other gods before me. Don't put anything else before you. Don't make any graven images. Don't do any of that kind of stuff. And they should know this. They should already know this. They should have been indoctrinated in this already. And yet, what happens during this time of Judges? They get into this kind of thing where they make covenant with the Canaanites. They make covenants with the Philistines. They allow these folks to stay around. You know, of course, last week, remember at the end of chapter 1, we talked about this a little bit where we had seen what? Where they decided instead of destroying them all, what did they do? They made them their slaves. And so now they're around with them all the time. They're intermixing with them. Now, let's look at verse 5 here in Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 5. But thus you shall deal with them, as you shall destroy their altars and break down the sacred pillars and cut down their wooden images and burn their carved images with fire. See, God doesn't want this. God knows exactly how fickle our hearts are. See, He understands it. And so what's He do here? He says, listen, if all of this stuff happens, if you go and marry them and you do all this kind of stuff, what is going to happen? You're going to get wrapped up in their idol worship. And we're going to look at that as we go through chapter 2, even more so, because we're going to see how this idolatry continued to grow and grow and grow in Israel. It continued to go on and on as they did it. So when you see this, and he very clearly gives this command to them, he says, thus you shall deal with them. You know, for a guy who's written policy for a number of years as a chief of police, had to write policy all the time. Shall means you will do that. Okay? There's no discretion in the word shall. Okay? I'm trying to think of a good one that you shall every year qualify with your firearm. Okay? There's no latitude to say, okay, well, you may do that, you may want to do that, you may not want to do that. Hey, you can do that if you feel like it, not that kind of thing. It says you shall. Okay? You shall qualify every year with a firearm. That's what God's saying here. No, he's not telling them to qualify with their firearm. Don't put that aside. That was just an illustration here to say what? God is saying to them, listen, you shall destroy all of these idols that are around you. Break down their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their woman images, and burn their carved images in fire. You see, he tells them very clearly what to do. But yet, see, the problem is they don't do it. And then look at verse 6. Real quick here, and then we'll get back to Judges here. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people to himself, a special treasure above all peoples on the face of the earth. And then look at verse 7 too. Just go down here. I know I didn't have that marked in there, but the Lord did not set his love on you, nor did he choose you because you were more in number than other people, because you were the least of peoples. See, God loves them. He's made this covenant with them. He says, listen, I love you. I care about you. But you got to do these things I tell you to do. And if you don't do them, there's going to be bad consequences for you because of it. See, that's the point he's trying to make to them all the time. And he continues to belabor this point. Now go to the next slide, Brian. There, because we get back to this cycle of sin that we've talked about several weeks now. We've been in this several times, and you say we're taking a lot of time to talk about this cycle of sin. But I think it's important to understand. And again, I know you can't read it, and it's hard to read on your paper there, but you see the numbers of the verses that we used last week when we were looking at this. First of all, we see what? A period of silence. We see this period of silence where God is not speaking to Israel. There's nothing much going on. It's kind of like status quo. Everything's okay. There's nothing real bad happening. And everything's okay. It's been quiet in terms of what's been going on with God or anything. And so what happens? Because of this quietness, what happens? It develops into sin. What's the thing? Idle hand or devil's work? Is that an old quote or something like that? Idle hands or devil's work. That's exactly what happens here. Idle hands becomes a devil's work. It becomes sin. They fall into sin. They get into sin. They walk away from God. And we're going to see this as we go through it, because remember now, Joshua has died. All this other generation now has died off. And because all this generation has died off, what didn't they do? They didn't ever teach the precepts. For those of you who are on Saturday morning study, precepts is an important word. They were never taught the precepts, and because they were never taught the precepts, they don't do what? They fall into sin. You see? It's very easy for them to fall into sin. This is why, I'll chase a rabbit here for a second, but this is why doctrinal integrity in the church today is so important. It's a critical piece that most in the American church are missing today. Because without doctrinal integrity, without teaching things precept upon precept upon precept, we water down the message. And when we water down the message, it lets us do what? The end of chapter 21 here in Deuteronomy, or Judges, where it says what? Everybody does what's evil and everybody does what's right in their own eyes. You see, everybody in the church essentially does what? They do what's right in their own eyes, instead of understanding the importance of being based upon the precept of the Word of God. You see, so this is important. This is a critical characteristic that is for us today in the church that we have to be aware of, because we've fallen into sin inside the church. And so then we see this servitude that happens, because what happens? Usually when there's sin, what goes on next? We fall into servitude because we don't have any precepts to help us out of it. We have no way to get out of it because we don't know how to get out of it. See, because we don't spend time in the Word, we don't spend time praying, we don't spend time doing these things that we need to do, and because of that, it does what? It locks us into servitude. And that bondage is there before us. So when tribulation comes, when all these bad things happen to us, we don't know how to deal with it. And so we're essentially in bondage to it. And because we're in bondage to it, what do we do then? Supplication then comes where we're crying out. We're crying out to God. We then decide we got to go somewhere. So we might as well try this God we're supposed to be serving. You know, we've heard about him before. Yeah, we know a little bit about him. Yeah, some time ago, they put some blood around the doorpost, and yeah, they did something, and everything was okay then. And so I guess if we do the same thing, we'll cry out to him. They delivered them out of that Egypt place or wherever that place is. And so now what do we got to do? We got to come straight to, so he'll do that for us, hopefully. You know, and God does it. And God does it. He brings them salvation through the judge. He brings them to a place of salvation through the judge. And so we see this constant cycle. But it doesn't relay what? It doesn't take the consequences away from them. And we see God led the consequences of God they proclaimed upon them in Leviticus 26, 23 through 26, that they would experience defeat at the hand of their enemies, they'd be despised, and repeated acts of graciousness and delivery constantly went on for judges. And the causes of judgment, really, significantly for Israel was their worship of idols. They turned away from God's gracious covenant. And because they turned away from that gracious covenant, what happened? The covenant was betrayed, not by God, but by Israel. And because it was disobeyed by them, what happened? And it's important that as he puts this down here, as we look at this was a serious breach to God and his covenant with Israel. And then, of course, we know that God's evidence of grace is always abounding, and that's what he does. And then, of course, it leads them back to this because we see the cycle of sin going on like 6 times in the book of Judges. We see this constant pattern of sin going on or this cycle of sin going on in Judges. Now, let's get down to this here because we're running out of time. We're not even going to be in thing. Get the next slide. So we see Judges chapter 2, where we start to see the seeds of apostasy coming on, where we see this happening. This chapter presses home the reality that God's people are expected to live faithfully or experience his discipline, and that's really what starts to go on here. Because we know that chapter 2, starting in verse 11 through 23, gives us this cycle of sin, and we'll talk more about that as we get into that in a couple of weeks. I don't know if we'll get quite there next week or not, but we might, but I don't know. So we see that that this cycle of sin leads to deliverance, and the reason why God brought judgment is because of their constant sin. This chapter really presses home the reality that God's people are... Well, I just read that. However, God is magnificently gracious and is praised for his unfailing love. Now, when we divide this into 3 sections. And we looked at that at the beginning here that we've already talked about on that very first slide or that second slide, wherever it was. God tells of his pronouncement of judgment upon the people because of their betrayal. And we'll look at that more significantly as we go through chapter 2 here. The second tells the tale of Israel's failure and God's patient response. And the last that we'll see in chapter 2 is it summarizes how God dealt with Israel and why. And then we see, and really the first part of this, the first part in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, we see this divine perspective from God. We see his perspective on this, and that's where his was laying first. So somebody read verses 1 through 5 for me. Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5.
The angel of the Lord went to Gilgal,
Yes.
spoke to him and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your forefathers. I said I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land. You shall break down your altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you what I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and your gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Dothan. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord.
Okay. So again, good, Brian. Chapter 2 presents this perspective of the historical account from God's point of view. The consequence of Israel's compromise will no longer use his power to drive out the Canaanites. Israel's compromise became a new God's new will for their lives. And look at this. When we break down these verses as we go through them here, and we'll get through some of them here tonight, that as we see, in the latter part of that where it says, you did not obey my voice, or before that, the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. See, that's the Lord's condemnation on Israel. He's laying it out to them and saying, listen, you remember Deuteronomy chapter 7. Here's what you were to do. Here's what I prescribed for you to do. They already have this portion. They know they're supposed to do that. And yet they don't do it. And because of that, go ahead to the next one, Brian. Because of that, Israel should experience the painful consequences of having the Canaanites around them to oppose them and lead them astray from worshiping the one true and living God. You know, and this was a pain experienced by Israel even to this day. We see that. Even this day. There's still all these people around them that are constantly bothering them. You know, it's a pain to them. Because they've obviously not been delivered out of it. Now, in the first two verses here, in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 2, we see God establishing, or not establishing, but restating these covenant promises and commands. Verses 1 and 2, he does this. Now, let me say this. The commentaries on Judges go, they don't really go, I don't want to say they go askew here a little bit, but the angel of the Lord could be Yahweh himself speaking, or could be one of his angels. Nobody is really sure about which it is. And I, to be honest with you, I don't think it really makes a difference which one it is. You know, if it's the angel of the Lord or it's Yahweh himself speaking, what's he telling them? Hey, dudes, you did wrong. You didn't. We had a contract. You signed the contract. You said, hey, I'm willing to do this. You were delivered out of Egypt. Everything was okay. I'm going to be your God. All of these kind of things. And what do? They don't follow through with it. They've welched on their side of the contract. And because of it, so God re-says this to them so they know. And that comes directly out of Exodus 23, chapter 23, and Exodus chapter 34. Then we see what? In verse 3 here, we see Israel's sin and God's judgment again for them. Because what's he say here to him? He says, listen, here's what your sin is. Here's what your sin is. But yet, what's happened? There's judgment for that. There's going to be this consequence that comes out as a result of your sin. There's going to be this significant this consequence that comes out before this sin. And so he's telling them that thing. And then the last thing Israel does is here in the last part of this verse is what do? They weep. Now it's interesting. Well, let me go through this and I'll talk about that here in just a second. But this really puts to this confrontation, if you will, that God is laying before them with his people in their actions. As we got through the narrative of chapter 1 and we saw this narrative that came out, we saw that Judah did a little bit of what they were supposed to do, but yet didn't necessarily live totally faithfully to it. And then, of course, we saw the rest of the tribes. They tried, but they couldn't do it because they never sought God out. They never looked for God. And because they couldn't wipe out those influences, the failure, particularly of Joseph in Joshua 17, had prepared them for this ultimate reality that God was going to continue to move them in this direction of this consequence for them. See, God was laying this out before them. See, some of the tribes demonstrated hesitancy to believe that God's promises were fulfilling their calling. See, they got scared. And because they got scared, they didn't do everything that God had called them to do. And since they didn't do that, because they didn't do that, they brought this consequence upon themselves, really. Because they didn't follow through with what he said. And so chapter 2 really reveals the problem that Israel had was deeper than a lack of faith. It was a trust in God and the reliance on his promises. I mean, it certainly involves a lack of faithlessness. It certainly does. But we see what? Ultimately, when you say you're faithless, that means you're doing what? Or you're unfaithful. You're doing what? You're not trusting God at all. You see? And so that's really what's going on here with Israel as they do this. And so in this passage here, in these passages here in verses 1 through 5, he explains the reason for his judgment. And this is a foundational principle for us. It's critical for us to understand that God has a right to be angry over Israel's conduct. He has definite right to be it. He's put them through all kinds of stuff. He's brought them out of all kinds of things. And so he has a right to be angry over their conduct. See, these choices are not merely private choices without any implication for somebody else. See, one tribe decides they're not going to do it, another tribe decides they're going to do it, but that has a consequence for the whole nation. See? It continues to have this consequence that's over us. And God committed himself to be faithful to Israel, and because he's committed to be faithful to them, he was going to rescue them and help them any way he can. But God's complaint to Israel is noticeable here when he says this. Now, it's interesting. Bakum, that word in Hebrew means weeping. That word means weeping. And so in verses 1 and 2 where he says, the angel of the Lord came upon Gilgal to Bakum and said, I led you up out of Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers and said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. But then go down at the end of the passage there in verse 5 where they called the name of the place Bakum and they sacrificed there to the Lord. Again, that name means weeping. They were weeping. Now, it's interesting. Here, this idea of weeping for them is not that they're turning away from their sin. This weeping is not to the place where they're actually saying, listen, I want to repent of my sin. See, they're weeping because they got their hand caught in the cookie jar. That's what they did. They got their hand caught in the cookie jar. God's holding them accountable for that. Because of that, they're doing what? They're weeping over it. Oh, God, please don't do this to us. Please don't do this. Please, you got to drive these guys out. No. And what he's saying is, listen, they lifted their voices and wept, but it was not a voice of redemption. They were still unrepentant of their sin. See, and so because of that, what happens? He continues to bring that consequence before them. So what do we see? We see a number of things here. First of all, that God eventually will deliver them from their bondage. He will eventually deliver them from their bondage. But it won't be till after, again, there's this crying out time where they truly are repentant. See, to where they're truly turning away from their sin. God had certainly blessed them. He blessed the land that they were in because he gave it to them. And so he doesn't want them to continue to fall in this pattern. He doesn't want them, but he has no other choice now. God committed himself unwavering to them, but they were not committed to God. And see, that's the difference. See, that's where that was the problem. God was committed to him, and God continues to be committed to him, but yet they were not totally committed to them. So, therefore, God expected that they will not make a covenant to live peaceably with the inhabitants of Canaan. He said, hey, because of what you've done now, you're going to face this consequence all the time. They're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to continue to be a problem for you. And so, God had a right to ask them to do what? To obliterate all these idols and everything in because he didn't want any of their gods before them. And because of that, they didn't do that, and so they're paying the consequences for it. And so he rails this against them as he gives it to them. Now God has the right to expect faithfulness and holiness from his people, and he has a right to judge it when they do not fulfill his expectations. Go to the next slide, Brian. So what do we see here in lessons for chapter 2 as we look at that, particularly in these first 5 verses here that we see? First of all, the Lord does not break his covenants with his people. Obviously, Judges chapter 2, 1 and 2, chapter 2, verse 1. But then in the New Testament verse for this is 2 Timothy 2:13. And then the next lesson for us today, as we look at this, is the Lord's people must not make covenants with the people of the world, 2:2, and James 4:4, not to be part of the world. We're in the world, but we're not to be a part of the world. You see. And then we see the same thing in chapter 2, in Judges chapter 2, verse 2. There's no good reason for disobeying the Lord, Titus 1:16. Again, He wants us to stay true to Him. He wants us to continue to stay true to Him. That's all He asks of us to do. And yet it's easy for us to do what? Pull away from Him. Even though we want to try to be faithful, but yet we still disobey Him and we turn our backs on Him. I mean, that's what we're talking about Sunday. Of course, we know verse 9. 1 John 1, verse 9 says what? If we truly know the Lord, that what? Then He's going to forgive us our sins and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. You see? If we do disobey Him, we know that we can come to our Father and ask for His forgiveness, and He will cleanse us of all unrighteousness if we truly are in Him. And then what? No, the evil influences of this world are like a snare to God's people. Chapter 2, verse 3, and then 2 Timothy 2:4 and 2 Peter 2:20. You can look up those verses later on and see what they have to say. So the evil influences that are out there in the world today become a snare for us. And I think it's, Sandy and I don't know if we talked about it in here or not, but we went and saw that movie, Insanity of God. And I think it's easier to be a Christian in those places, even though you're facing persecution and all the bad things that happen to you as a result of it. It's easier to be a Christian there than it is in the United States. Because you truly have to trust and have faith all the time. Where in the United States we have all these what? We have all these other things bombarding us all the time that are easily pulling us away from God. It's easy for us to pull away from God here. Look at the places we live. I mean, just look at everything we have that's around us. And it's easy to simply pull us away from being a part of God's economy. And so I think we have to be careful. Then the last slide there, Brian, is small compromise. A small compromise is never small. A small compromise is never small. It's always going to relate something much bigger. Sin not dealt with always leads to greater sin, and then to what? Spiritual ruin. See, when that small sin compounds itself and continues to compound itself and compound itself, it does what? It leads to spiritual ruin eventually. Sometimes we don't see it right away. Sometimes it doesn't happen right away. But eventually that's what's going to happen. It's going to continue to do what? It's going to continue to grow and grow and grow until it leads to spiritual ruin. Sin has an inherent, painful, even enslaving consequences for it. It does. It produces bondage for us. Because once we're in that pattern of sin, it's easy for us to stay in it. The Casting Crowns is my favorite group. If you don't know who they are, Casting Crowns is a Christian pop group. But anyhow, one of their songs is what's the name of it, Brian? Slow Fade. And in the song Slow Fade, what it talks about is it doesn't just happen all of a sudden. It's a slow process that goes on. And it happens for us as Christians too. That's a slow fade. Once that first little step is taken in sin, then it continues to grow and grow. And then we see the bondage that it leads to. And then finally, we see the small compromises today may lead to the apostasy of the next generation. You see, as parents, if we're not teaching our kids foundational principles of the truth, what happens? They turn their back on it. Now, they can turn their back on it even though they have the foundational principles of the truth in them. They can still turn their back on it. We know that. Proverbs make it very clear that sometimes kids are going to turn their back, but yet we know at some point in time, hopefully they'll come back. But here's the point, is that and this is what happened in Judges. You see, this nation failed to teach the precepts upon precepts to what? To their children. And because they failed to do that, because they failed to do those kind of things, what then happens? It leads them into sin. It leads them back into this bondage again. And this continues to be a what? It continues to be a snare to them always. continues to be a snare to them always.